Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. And we're continuing on as usual. There's plenty to cover, more than usual, but plenty of developments both on and off the battlefield in Ukraine, and a lot of developments in the Middle East. We have quite a bit to talk about Turkey, and just the general roundup of news. We'll get into some domestic stuff with the U.S. Maybe we'll join the Commonwealth. That's a story that's being proposed. Some European antics coming, particularly from France and the UK. Who else but? And we'll see what we can get to in terms of economic news. Like I said, I'm not going to focus too much on that, but it's been a very turbulent time economically. What else can you really say? But without further ado, we can get right into some frontline coverage in Ukraine.
Yeah. I messed up the sequence. If you could put the overall map, that will show you where most of the activity has been happening today, which is March 23rd, the Sunday. The first front line that we're going to visit is not indicated on the map, but it was yesterday and the day before. So if you've already put on the frontline map, we can now switch to the map for Zaporozhye, and I've outlined the gains basically that the Russians have had here. This is a sector of the front that has been kind of dormant for many months, with only small gains here and there by the Russians. The Russians have largely retaken all the territory that the Ukrainians took in 2023, and now, as you can see in this map, they've begun to retake them. Now, I've circled cities. The one on the left is Kamienka, and the one on the right is Pokrovsk. And so you can see there's a huge chunk of land that the Russians took in the last few days, and a little bit of a red sector where they've taken a little bit more. Um, this is in the town of just north of Pyatikhatke in Lup Lupkovke. Like the map is obscuring the name, but it is a village just outside the perimeter of Kamienka, and so you can see it there. Now, the Russians are going to want to push from here, going westward toward Kamienka, but as you can see in this map with the blue outlines, these two areas are ridges. They are high points. And so the Russians will have to overcome that. And I have a topographical map, again, outlining where Kamienka and I know I mispronounced Orikhov, not Pekrovsk, Orikhov. So the one on the left is Kamienka, and the one on the right is Orikhov. You can see both towns are in low-lying areas, and you can probably determine where the Russians are going to go based on the ridge lines that we see here. Not that these are very high, but any height matters. And then I have another map just to um, go back to the overall view of this sector, and you can see that the Ukrainians have substantial fortifications north of this sector, outlined in yellow. So this will not be an easy place to take for the Russians, but again, they've made quite a few gains here. The next sector we're going to look at moving eastward is Pokrovsk. And now the Russians recently retook Shevchenko, and they have taken more territory in the south. The Ukrainians, on their part, have kicked the Russians out of Udachne, but the Russians are still holding to this west flank of Pokrovsk, as you can see, outlined in black. The yellow outlines are the areas where the Ukrainians have taken, and the red outlines are the Russians, along with the black. So the next slide will show you where the Ukrainians have made some gains. It's north of the city, the town of Udachne. The Ukrainians had retaken this town, but as of yesterday or the day before, the Russians retook this town. Uh, and as I said earlier, they're still holding on to Kotline. So this is a very difficult area for the Russians. One of the complaints that they have is as soon as they send in reinforcements or just basically supplies like water and food or ammunition, they are immediately harassed by by Ukrainian drones. The big semicircle that you see in the top right-hand corner, that's Pokrovsk, the city itself. It stretches further south, but that's the general area. Um, so not an easy going. Now, the Russians have started creating these roads with nets that are covered from both sides and on the top in order to deal with this. Um, and as we said in this show before, the drones are one of the things that have completely changed the battlefield in Ukraine. They are accounting for more deaths on both sides than artillery was in 2022, 2023, and even the first half of 2024. So this yeah, so drones have made the difference, and as I said, more casualties are caused by drones on both sides than artillery, and it's probably cheaper in many ways to use drones than 155 or 152 millimeter shells, and both sides are taking advantage of this because it's easier to do at scale. The warehouses where these are manufactured can be much smaller. They're much more difficult to detect. And as we've said on the show many times before, it literally is this plus the financial backing and the military backing of at least 33 countries that is keeping Ukraine going. So we move to Toretsk now, where the situation has been more or less stabilized by the Russians. The city hasn't fallen as I was worried that it might. Um, that little red dot is an area where the Ukrainians had breached south of and taken over a stadium. Now, shortly after our last episode, the Russians took this territory back, and the Ukrainians haven't made a gain here since I believe the 12th of March. So the last time they made a gain was 11 days ago. And the Russians have made a gain here. In the next slide, you can see in relation to the rest of the city to the east, in an area just outside of Druzhba. The Russians are going to want to capture more and more of this territory. They'll need it because not far above from here is Bakhmut. Now, I don't have a slide, but the Russians have gained more territory in Bakhmut. First, they gained territory south of of the town, and then they also now have further encircled that industrial plant where a lot of Ukrainian soldiers are holed up. And then the last slide is a close-up of this field that that the Russians have captured along with a fortification just east of Druzhba. The next area we're going to look at is the Svatovo-Kupiansk front. The Russians have made some gains, some more gains along the Oskal River, south of Kupiansk. That you can see the red dots sort of in the middle of the frame. The next slide will show you where they're right next to the water reservoir, and this is in the town of Zarozovye. Uh, Now this has been a difficult fight, and the Russians are smart to use the water on their right flank as they move further south. But Kupiansk has been a very tough fight. I'm gonna there's one more close up if you wanna put it up, Constantine, and then we can move to the Kupiansk front proper. Yeah, so the Kupiansk front, you can see that the Ukrainians have made several incursions. They have whittled away areas of Russia's incursion into this Kursk area. In fact, they're working on the southern part quite well. The area that is south of Sinkovka. If I'm not mistaken, it looks like they've regained positions that were just out of Petropavlovsk and some of the forest. Now, this was a very tough area that the Russians uh, spent a lot of time and men in order to capture. Again, the blue outlines are Ukrainian achievements, and the yellow lines are again Ukrainian achievements, but only in the last few days or weeks. The black represent Russian gains. The next slide shows you a very tiny area that the Russians have taken outside of Figolivka. Figolivka. Figolivka is a town that the Russians used to control, and now they're in the midst of trying to retake it. So the next slide will show you the situation better. Again, these are very small gains, uh, and I don't know how intense the fighting is here, but I can say that ever since the failure of the Kursk front for the Ukrainians, they have been able to redeploy their units. Now, History Legends did a very good video on this. And, all that talk, especially because Trump kept bringing up that there were thousands of men that were surrounded. I don't, I myself didn't go on about it because I just didn't see the confirmation. I didn't see the big, I saw Ukrainians who had surrendered, but I didn't see that many. And so according to him, basically the Ukrainians, like most of the vehicles that got hit, remember in the last show I talked about a column that was destroyed, but most of the vehicles looked like civilian vehicles or just like the odd BMP. And that is true. Now you're going to see videos with like Abrams and Challengers and you know um Soviet era tanks that were destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. But those are losses that happened, during the months that were there. And yes, some of them were destroyed when they went to um, reinforce the incursion into Kursk. But on if we're talking about the last few days, the only thing that got destroyed were well, I mean, that was significant were some Bradley, some strikers, and some senators. These are infantry fighting vehicles. Senators are Canadian. I don't know if they're based on the striker or not, but anyways. So the next map is Vovchansk. You can see this is basically a city in complete ruin. Now, it's not a city. I mean, I don't think it's more than 40,000 people. Maybe for some people that's a city, but to me that's a town. But the Russians have been able to slowly regain the territory that they've lost here. And of course, this is one of those places in Ukraine that is in complete ruin. There are areas that look, remember Klishevka, how there was almost like nothing there, or
Yes,
Robotina.
yes.
This is kind of like that. It's just nearly as bad. So, in other words, like worse than Bakhmut. The next slide is the Kursk Sumy Belgorod region, because not to be outdone, the Ukrainians have decided to make another incursion into Russia after essentially being forced out of Kursk. Now, I should mention here that as the Ukrainians were retreating, they managed to blow up um, a kind of gas station that was the same gas station that is connected to the gas pipeline that the Russians used, the Druzhba pipeline, in order to basically oust the Ukrainians out of Suja and therefore almost the entirety of the of Kursk. this set off quite a fire. The other thing that they've done is, you know, less less than 12 hours after this agreement to not, well,
The
at least
the energy
Putin,
ceasefire.
the energy ceasefire, the Ukrainians launched an attack on the Engels Air Force Base, and they also hit an oil facility
In
in Krasnodar.
yes,
Some people, including myself, got mixed up that it was an oil facility in Engels, but it wasn't. Engels is important because some of Russia's long-range bombers fly out from there. So obviously, Ukraine is not interested in a ceasefire. The British are not interested in a ceasefire. And for that matter, neither are the Russians, unless they get what they want. And, Trump isn't going to give them what they want, and neither are the Ukrainians, and neither is the rest of the West. Now, if you'll hold on, I'm going to show you. Um, I think I do have topographical maps. Well, not topographical maps. Rather, I have. Um, I have photos of the strike. Now, the strike looked very impressive. There were people who said that they could feel the blast from several kilometers away. Um, but let me bear with me.
I'll just go on about the energy ceasefire bit.
Yeah, you go
So
ahead. Thank you. Thank
this
you.
was Trump's big breakthrough in order to bring home a diplomatic victory because, as we've seen, he's been running his head against a wall. And Zelensky has been uncooperative. He eventually caved. He gave him the ISR back, permitted the aid to continue, played along with the Franco British plan in order to send 30,000 peacekeepers to a frozen front line, which was never going to happen, as we all know. And in his 2.5 hour long phone call with Putin, aside from the U.S. Russia hockey game they're trying to arrange, which I think is probably the bigger breakthrough in that phone conversation, he also got the Russians to agree to withhold strikes for 30 days on energy infrastructure pending Ukraine's approval. Now, the Russians did agree to it. However, it should be noted that when the media reported this, it was Russia agrees to 30-day ceasefire. They ran with it, especially the right-wing media that wants to make Trump look as good as possible. Ran with it. He got the ceasefire, etc., etc., etc. But what he got from Putin, in effect, was an agreement for the Russians to hold off on their strikes on energy infrastructure until their next round. Because you'll notice with the pattern of strikes, it is about 4 weeks between these barrages on particularly energy infrastructure against the Ukrainians. They'll do it about once a month, once every 4 weeks, sometimes more frequently depending on it, and sometimes in the winter more often because they are more reliant on those energy systems. And as we're coming into spring, a lot of those energy systems, particularly for heating, are less in use. But this was supposed to be Trump's big diplomatic victory. It wasn't much in the first place, but as we were telling you before, as GSP was telling you, not even 12 hours into it, the Ukrainians started to scuttle it. But I'll go ahead and get those
Yeah.
satellite images up right now.
So the top one is the before, and the bottom one is the after. So you can see that the damage isn't as extensive as it looked. Now, the Russians, in retaliation, uh, uh, bombed Odessa very heavily, and Kryvyi Rog and Kiev. Um, Kind of like essentially is payback for attacking Engels. Obviously, the Ukrainians cannot reach Engels Air Force Base without American and British backing. Like, they can't do this target acquisition without the kind of intelligence that either or both of those countries would provide. So
It looks like
you
revoking
know,
that ISR for 6 days did wonders.
yeah, 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 yeah. So So yeah, I mean, a lot of people were very hopeful about this peace deal. I certainly wasn't.
No, of course not.
Yeah. So especially the guys on the Duran.
I have to
I mean,
say,
they're hopeful, but it is measured. They do say that it'll have to be in Russia's terms, etc. But
compared to us, not to, and I'm saying this in a completely value neutral sense, compared to us, they are a wellspring of optimism.
yeah,
But
yes, they are.
yeah, a lot of people did seize on this. There were some more skeptical ears of this. One person, which I'm sure I don't need to bring this to my audience's attention because you probably know if you're listening to this, Brian Berletic has probably been the most prescient
Yeah.
on Trump's diplomatic efforts. I'm not going to sign on to everything he says regarding this issue, at least, but he has been correct more often than not in the recent weeks regarding a lot of this,
Oh
with
yeah.
the quote unquote outsourcing this to Europe. And we'll talk about that later when we get into some of the British antics, when we get into the continuation of this great and wonderful plan, how serious the British really are about it, how much of a diplomatic maneuver it is, so on and so forth. But we can continue if you had anything else you wanted to go over on the front line.
No, that's it for the front line. We can get into the meat and bones of all these other issues right now.
Yes, and gee, where to begin? What I do think is interesting is I'll go over some brief points that Peter Szijjarto made in an interview that he gave during this week, Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjarto, of course. And a lot of it was about Ukraine, so just some particular clips. These came from RT, so that's just put out there, that's the source. He said the Biden administration was, quote, in favor of war while Trump is in favor of peace. We really cherish the ongoing talks between the U.S. and Russia. And I'm not going to. I'm going to try not to analyze every one of these statements in great detail, but I will put commentary where I feel is necessary. This is typical Hungarian diplomatic posturing, where even though their actions at times may seem much more Eastern, especially when somebody like Trump is in the White House, they are very eager to butter him up. They're very eager to play diplomacy with this. And like I said, we can talk about the finer points. Maybe Trump's diplomatic efforts aren't what they seem. But of course, Yarto is going to say that, heading forward, that, oh, Trump is the peace guy. And he continues on saying he believes since Trump has entered office, the world has become a much more safer place. Once again, you see that padding out because the risk of escalation of war is much lower compared to Biden times. Um, Saying the majority of those in Brussels want the war to be continued. There's not much more you can really say about that. He goes on about the European reasoning. Like I said, you can watch the interview on your own if you want to get too much into it. And I'll talk about a little bit about the Witkoff interview with Tucker Carlson because I think whether you like either of those figures or not, there was quite a bit of insight in terms of what the administration policy actually is. But like I said, I'm not going to jump the gun here. But Jarto did call out the attacks on the Druzhba Turk Stream pipeline, saying, quote, if you attack energy security of a country, it must be considered an attack on its sovereignty. Russia has always been a very reliable supplier of to the energy needs of Hungary, period. So, very standard line, what you'd expect. The Hungarians and the
Yeah.
Russians have very strong economic relations in that regard, so you wouldn't expect them to really go the other way on that. Saying,
If you pay your bills, Russia won't do anything.
yeah,
Just pay your bills.
they are in that way a very transactional country, and unless you're the Poles who decide we're not going to pay for the contract that we signed because of terms that don't violate the contract, blah 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 blah, and Jarto goes on to continue saying, in his words, patriotic governments in Europe have been subject to tremendous attacks. Look at what they've been doing to Fico. That's the one particular example he brings up.
Yes, saw that.
He talks about the effort in the European Parliament to strip Hungary of its voting rights, which, as we all know, and it the funny part about that vote is they would need the Hungarians to consent to it, as well as Slovakia, as well as
Yeah.
it would need to be a unanimous vote in order to strip the Hungarians of their voting rights. So it's a moot point. It's diplomatic posturing. But one of the probably most interesting point is that he talked about the economic situation, saying, quote, the EU has stabbed the European economy in its heart by the sanctions, and elaborated by saying the EU has isolated itself diplomatically uh, by having the competition of who can say, quote, the nastiest thing about Trump, cutting ties with Russia, imposing tariffs on Chinese EV imports, and putting preconditions on cooperation with Africa. So once again, we're seeing probably the only functional government within the European Union. If you want to consider Slovakia, fair enough, but in terms of being outspoken about it, one of the only functional governments in the European Union that actually has a coherent foreign policy speaking. And I stand by my statement that regardless of any other problems, if the Hungarians were in charge of the entirety of EU foreign policy, the world would be a much better place. Europe would be a much better place. The world would be a much better place. Like I said, I encourage you guys to watch it if you get the chance, because I don't know if you want to consider Hungary Western. I think there is in the proper sense, of course, they are part of the European Union, they are part of NATO, etc., etc. But I don't know if you want to consider it maybe in the proper civilizational sense. But in terms of Western or Western adjacent governments, even including Trump, who some might think is more reasonable than previous administrations, which I think there's reason to think that, they are the only Western government, for lack of a better word, to actually be bringing the real issues to the forefront and actually be publicly stating these and really going against the grain. Like I said, I can sing the praises of the Hungarians and their government all day, despite their issues. And yes, no government's perfect. There's the obvious disclaimer, but once again, I think for those of you who are listening, for any newcomers, I just want to put that out there. But for those of you who are listening, whenever I have these praises, of course, it always comes to preconditions. I don't blindly accept everything these people say. I understand the problems, but I'm talking about the upsides right now. I can talk about the criticisms later,
Mhm.
but they're not relevant at this exact moment. But like I said, good interview. I would certainly recommend you check it out, because it really is the only coherent foreign policy coming out of the European Union.
Yeah, it is amazing how steadfast Orban has been through all of this. Now we all know, like, there's many times where he will vote against something which the EU or NATO wants that will, let's say, weaken Russia, or maybe another way to put it is prolong the war. And then eventually he caves. He caves because he has to, but he uses whatever ability he still has, and of course
But he
the
also uses
U.S.
these votes to extract concessions, like sanctions
That's
waiver
yes,
on the energy industry.
absolutely. No, you're completely right about that. And and in many ways, were it not for him, you wouldn't hear anything from the EU about, like, who is committing these attacks against like Turk Stream, for instance. The, if it's not Fico or him, who is it? I mean, I don't even know if Vucic says anything, but um,
Let me just
so
say, if there was somebody like Orban in France or Germany or even the UK who were saying the same things, or somebody like Jarto, they would be assassinated.
oh yeah,
It's
they
that
would be
simple.
killed.
If it was in a country that had that
And
much influence
we'll get
within
into the
Europe,
JFK files, but
yeah, we'll certainly talk about that. That might warrant its own episode, but like I said, we'll touch on some of that stuff because there's some interesting things in there. But yeah, if it were a more significant country than Hungary, they would be either in a cell or in the grave.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. It goes without saying, but it does bear repeating. So yeah, I mean, the way I see this past week, there's a very concerted charm offensive by the Trump administration, meant to butter up Putin. And of course, if Putin um, uh, rejects this, it'll be just like, let's say, Zelensky ignoring the and if energy infrastructure ceasefire. It'll be equated to being more or less the same thing. But Putin, they well know that Putin cannot concede
We're gonna get a
on any
nasty
of these
Truth Social
points.
post if he doesn't concede.
Yeah, the all caps.
Putin is a very smart guy, but he's making a very foolish decision. All caps.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like I
Something like,
know,
yeah, you guys know what to expect at this point.
absolutely, absolutely. And if there's one thing that the Russians have been patient in this war, is that they don't really care what the media has to say. They understand that the media eventually, the media narrative, to be specific, eventually will come at a clash with the reality on the ground. And in this case, the reality on the ground are the Russian demands. Because of course, if the West says no to the Russian demands, then the war goes on. But you notice when that happens, particularly the U.S. is very troubled by it, and they scramble to find a way to end this war, but on terms that are not completely suitable to the U.S. To the Russians, but let's say amenable to the U.S. and less so for the European partners like the British. So, they're trying the charm offensive now. Of course, Starmer is again saying that he's going to send troops, but only after a ceasefire, which is just his way of essentially ruining the possibility of any ceasefire. Just as Boris Johnson made sure that the war would go on, that's essentially Starmer's job.
Yeah,
It doesn't matter
that's
whether
that's all that
they're
is.
they're Labor, Tory, there's a unanimity there that they're all going to stick to violently. So
And then it creates, of course, more divide in Europe, which is something Trump wants to do because even with the German and Italian governments being very pro Ukraine, I don't think anyone can deny that. Whenever they hear these French and British proposals to put peacekeepers there, they say we're out. They say we're not putting ourselves in the
yeah,
line, we're not putting our militaries in the line in order
yeah,
to indulge this fantasy project. Of course, we'll go along and chill with Ukraine, even though it was interesting because the Spanish and the Italians, which are not the biggest but bigger economies in Europe, were waffling on one of the recent Ukraine aid packages. So, like I said, I think Trump's approach so far has created some level of disunity in Europe, which is something
yeah,
I do think he and his foreign policy team does want. Not only European division with Russia, but European division within itself. Because, I mean, look at the way they're behaving. None of them can come to a consensus. I think that's probably the biggest proof. I know it's been said before. The biggest proof this is not an existential threat is that fact that nobody can come to a consensus because there's nothing urgent. There's nothing seriously on the line for Europe except reputation. Because I mean, their economy is already in the gutter. They already signed that death warrant. It's I mean, what more to lose at that point? But at this point, just time so they can have their little table meetings and debate about what's the best way forward for Ukraine in order to look like we're supporting it, in order to keep ourselves relevant to the most powerful country in the world. And I'm not even
yeah,
saying that in a triumphalist sense, but I'm just saying that objectively, the Europeans,
yeah.
in order to maintain their global relevance, need to be directly under the Americans. They need to be the top vassals. They can't have that pivot to Japan. They can't have that pivot to East Asia. They can't have that pivot to the Middle East. As it stands now, the Europeans, in order to stay relevant, especially after they nuked their own economy, both in terms of foolish domestic policies and even more foolish foreign policies, they need to keep themselves attached to the hip of the Americans, who are at this point looking for a way out in many ways. Now, I don't think that's the entire story. Don't get me wrong, but at least that's the surface of it, and that causes panic in Brussels. That causes panic in London, in Paris, in Berlin, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think the peculiar predicament that that Europe finds itself in is without America, they become unglued because America is really the only thing that can direct their goals in a certain direction where although that could at times create squabbles, it historically it's been able to subside those squabbles and find some kind of consensus. What you're getting now is right is that the squabbles, the lines are more prominent than they were under Biden, and all it had to do was Trump messaging, even though I don't take his messaging seriously, that the U.S. is ready to drop the war in Ukraine. Look, they want to drop it, but only if there is a Europe that is united to fight on behalf of America in Ukraine.
Yeah, they've realized
Eh,
it's a lost cause, but they don't want to give the Russians too much of an upper hand in Europe, so they need the Europeans to do some more of the heavy lifting. That's the entire
that's
basis of this
yes,
policy.
right. And the Europeans understand that in many ways they got themselves into this mess for listening and obeying America in the first place. And now that there's division, they need America back more than ever in order to resolve these differences. But I don't think, in this sense, yes, Trump is leaving. America might reinvest into NATO on a, like, let's say, on a political level after Trump. We saw this, let's say, when Biden came into power. I mean, Biden is the president that provoked this war against Russia. Putin tried for months to resolve this issue. He did not want this war. That is obvious. The facts are the facts. And so, um, I think they followed, presuming that they were going up against, let's say, the Russia of 2014 to 2015. The economy would fall apart. Of course, they also knew that they had a much better military than they did in 2015, 14. So it was kind of in the bag. And a lot of
And
these other countries, except for China, probably all the other countries were not going to take Russia's side. And America and the Western countries did their utmost to stick together, where they all agreed on every iota of their narrative. But it just didn't work. And after 3 years, it's still not working. The media narrative, and along comes Trump, and he's saying things that, this is a proxy war. Rubio, in fact, said that. But ultimately, it's what Pete Hegseth said, which
Rubio
was,
even used the phrase "it's a multipolar world now," and
yeah, he did. In a way, I mean, he's saying, I hate this multipolar
yeah,
world.
like I said, I'm saying he said that in a very objective way. It's not like somebody who
Yes,
say has been
that's
talking about
right.
this for 10 years saying it would be a benefit, but he has acknowledged reality, and there has been some sort
He
of
that
acknowledgement
Yes,
of reality on the ground. And like I said, you can,
right. Which is something the narrative refused to do.
yeah,
The narrative that was um, essentially galvanized almost as soon as the war started.
and in many ways, I suppose if you want to really stretch it out, if you really want to blame Trump for why this war effort has failed, you could say him changing the narrative on China in his first term led to a scenario in which China was never going to go along with sanctions on Russia or a pressure campaign on Russia. And then you had Biden come in, reassure the Europeans, and launch this war on the Russian front. While also, because the ball had been rolling, continued many of the Trump policies on China. So,
E-
I suppose in a roundabout
Excellent
way,
point.
if you want to, especially if you're a resistard, if you want to blame Trump for this war, that's the way you can do it.
Yes, yes. I just happen to think that it's two different factions that have been arguing about
Oh, I agree.
what to do next for the last 15 years. I think these factions preceded Trump, they preceded Biden.
Yes, in all
I
seriousness, I agree, but I do think these are the manifestations. And of course, I was being a little
Yeah, yeah.
facetious with the whole resist art thing, but yeah, I had
It's
to
it's
because
fine.
they, well, it's because Trump is Agent Krasnov. That's what they're not telling you. Okay,
I sent you those screen caps from that stupid YouTube channel, Vlad Vox something, Volex or this guy is so crazy. I mean, he is such I don't know, he's so feminine. Like he's wearing not a mask, not like the surgical masks everyone was wearing during
like
COVID.
the N95.
And he's not wearing an N95 mask. He's wearing a mask that delivers oxygen.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's the one. It
And he had a cold. He had a cold, and I thought, oh, you know what? I mean, I'm not sub to him, but on your in your suggestions panel, he popped up after 2 weeks. I'm going. this dude is still going on with this oxygen mask. Like, you don't even sound like you have a cold, but the comments are just breathtaking. You can blame Agent Craster. Like, it's just so dumb. I mean, these people buy this hook, line, and sinker. The whole 27 minutes that video was about saving democracy, democratic institutions. This is, and of course, they were talking about Erdogan, but it applies to all dictators, right? Of course, the country I live in, there's no dictatorship at all, right? Anyways, I'm going way, way off.
Don't blame me. I voted for the brown woman.
Yeah, yeah. So, just absolute geopolitical retardation. So, anyways, I couldn't resist sending you that stuff.
Oh, yeah,
My
that.
favorite was the woman who said, "This is why living is pointless." Like, she says we might as well. She's thinking about killing herself because she sees, like, no, like, what's happening in Erdogan is going to happen all over Europe, and
Well,
oh
I
my
hope
god,
she's not in Canada, or else she might actually follow through with that.
yeah.
Yeah, very interesting healthcare
She
system
very well, yeah,
in
exactly.
the Great
Sick.
White North. It's yeah, but with that aside out of the way, because Trump is Agent Crass after all, I do love these copes. He's been in the KGB since 1987. Okay, and you know what? The fall of the Soviet Union, it was just a feint. Russia gave up most of its territory as a feint. It allowed NATO to creep to its border just as a feint. You guessed it.
Yeah,
In order
that's right.
to get the tangerine tyrant into the White House to ruin democracy.
That's right. Putin really wasn't negotiating. It was a bluff. All those meetings all throughout 2021, from June to December, then another one in January, whenever. No, that was all a bluff.
It was. Uh,
Like, I mean, like, every projection is an admonition. Like, uh,
I'm just saying, right wing schizos are bad, but left wing schizos are on a whole nother level.
yeah, they really are in a whole other level. Yeah,
It's
like,
but it's okay because we're all going to be subjects to the British Commonwealth soon, and it's yeah, it'll work itself out. Okay, you thought Trump was KGB, he's MI6.
yeah, yeah. I mean, okay. So normally, if a president has been, or a leader of, let's say, whatever country, has been completely subverted by a foreign power and is deemed to be a foreign agent, you would expect all kinds of data dumps on this, right? Like, why don't they have any? Why? I mean, he's a prominent figure. He's going there during this. You think the U.S. Did not keep tabs on him and what he was doing in Russia, right? I mean, unless you think like half the CIA are all Russian agents too, right?
Do you have any evidence they're not?
Although I did see a very interesting documentary Heathrow's been in the news, right? There was a fire at Heathrow, and of course, it took less than 24 hours to suggest Putin was behind it.
Naturally.
Naturally, so of course. But there's the case of Prime Minister Wilson. Now, he was a British prime minister twice, once in the 60s, believe like mid 60s, late 60s, like 68, and then another time, I think, in 1976. Anyways, um, once the show is done, I'm going to make a comment and find the link. But very interesting show. It had been presumed that Wilson was a KGB agent, that he had communist sympathies, right? And what MI5 decided to do was to create a potential emergency government and a potential leader. He wouldn't be a prime minister per se, but he would be the sort of emergency leader as they ousted Wilson. And that leader that they had chosen would be Lord Mountbatten, who, of course, was killed by
Hmm.
the IRA. Wilson eventually resigned because the pressure was too mounting, and that's what led the way for Thatcher. And essentially, this group got everything that they wanted with Thatcher. The other thing is, Wilson, in his second time as prime minister, was not really able to stem the economic difficulties. Like I remember this, the '70s were not easy. They were not, and neither were the early '80s as well. I don't know if, I mean, I guess our listening audience doesn't know this because they're like your age, but
I've checked the age
I can
demographic.
vouch
It's
for that.
it's a pretty nice sized pyramid, so some of them might.
Yeah, so those were difficult times, and I remember as a kid watching newsreels from the BBC, all the coal miners that were on strike, all kinds of things. So the British economy in the '70s and early '80s was not in good shape, and many will say that it never properly recovered. But so yes, so the ousting of a president, like I mean, the Americans did try to oust Trump, whether you like him or not, and I don't believe that where they attempted to kill him in Pennsylvania. Was it Butler, Pennsylvania?
Yes,
Yeah, I don't believe it was just that skinny, scrawny 19-year-old that
it
did it.
never is. I mean,
No,
look, the
I
JFK
think there was a
files
concerted.
are
Yeah, there was a
interesting
concert.
enough, but I want to see the
Yeah,
Trump files.
right. Right. So, anyways, so I guess this past week, that's what we saw. Uh, Ways of trying to butter up to Putin because they really do need to get a ceasefire. They want to freeze the conflict. And they want a Europe. I mean, Trump wants a Europe essentially that in 5 to 6, maybe 10 years is able to raise an army to go more directly against Russia and for a second war, for a round two. And that's what
Simultaneously,
Russia is not giving them while they focus on Iran.
simultaneously, while decoupling Russia from China,
Oh yeah.
which
By the way, everybody says it was Kissinger, but do you know some historians are saying that was actually Nixon's idea.
I believe it.
It was not Kissinger's. Kissinger's was entrusted to go there and to pitch the idea to the Chinese. But I mean, our audience is fairly well educated, so they would know that the Russians and the Chinese at this point already had a war. They were on the outs for several years, so it was not
Pretty much ever
so
since Stalin
difficult.
died and Khrushchev came to power, that's when the
Yes,
divide really started to cement itself. And then by the time the '60s came around, it was pretty much the only thing unifying them was Vietnam and keeping the Americans out of
yes,
Vietnam. And once that was ended, it all fell apart when it came to any sort of cooperation between the two. To the point where when the Russians go into Afghanistan, do you know who's manufacturing the small arms that America is smuggling through Pakistan? China is.
yep. And I don't know if the Russians were because I don't know if people know, but after 1975, there was a war between China and Vietnam. So the very country that supported it is now at war with Vietnam,
Yeah,
and the
that's
Russians were supplying the arms to Vietnam.
yeah,
So
that's where you get into Cambodia, where Pol Pot was aligned with China. Vietnam invaded
yes,
Cambodia, so on and so forth. The Soviet Union was squarely in the camp of Vietnam, and it was complete infighting within the communist bloc at that point. And even North
hmm
Korea was pro-Soviet versus pro-Chinese. So it all fell apart. But China was the driver of revolution for a lot of the communist movements in Africa. Not to get off on too much of a tangent. Angola, I think, is probably the main example. But uh, like like I said, at that point, it was an exploitation of an existing rift. But to bring it back around to the relevant point here, that rift simply does not exist. I mean, to reference your point, in 1969, there was a brief shooting war between the Soviet Union and China that the Nixon administration was actually able to stop by threatening military force against both sides. But there's no existing rift between the Chinese and the Russians now that could really result in that. And I think if you want to bring it down to the most base level, of course, there's always Iran, there's China's investments in the Middle East, but when it comes to energy, China is mostly dependent on Russia. And a lot of people will talk about the Chinese economic engine. I don't want to downplay that. China has a very powerful economy that can very likely overtake the U.S. By the end of the decade. We'll see how that actually plays out. But the Chinese need Russian energy. They need energy from Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the Gulf states. And also, when it comes to military cooperation, when it comes to R&D, I'm not going to, the Chinese are nothing to sneeze at. They're a very capable people on their own. But when it comes to a lot of R&D, when it comes to a lot of technological developments, particularly within the sphere of military, those are coming from Russia. And
That's right.
when you also talk about the nuclear industry, like China, of course, is capable of building its own plants, but Rosatom dominates the global markets when it comes to nuclear energy. Now, in terms of actual size, in terms of, say, their share of the market, I can't speak to that exactly, but from start to finish, they'll build them, they'll supply them, they'll maintain them. It's an all-service package, and that's why so many countries, even after the war in Ukraine, have invested in Russian nuclear power. Which is why I always like. I don't want to go off on too much tangent because I want to get into the Witkoff interview in just a minute here. Which is why I always laugh when people talk about European energy independence being nuclear power because at the end of the day, what's the most available market to them before the war in Ukraine? It's the Russians. Yeah, sure. They get uranium from Africa. Nigeria was a large source from that. Niger, before the coup in 2023, was also a large source of European uranium. West Africa, but it's been plunged into turmoil. And once again, do we see who's picking up the pieces that the French have left behind upon their retreat? It's the reformed Wagner Group, which, funny enough, has called themselves Africa Corps now. So like I said, while a lot of people want to talk about the Russian-Chinese relationship, wanted to paint it as this junior partnership, Russia's become an economic colony of China. It's it's a much more balanced relationship than people would think, and
Yeah.
especially at this point, neither one can afford to stab the other in the back, nor does the West have any sort of material or any other sort of offering to encourage one or the other to do that.
That's right. The rhetoric and the actions by the US and by its Western vassals have made it impossible to reach any kind of negotiation, any kind of lasting negotiation. And it will not be a negotiation that is going to ruin this very complementary relationship that the Russians have with the Chinese. Just think of if Russia flipped on China, the next thing that would happen is America would interdict Saudi oil, Iranian oil going to China. That's what would happen. And they would stranglehold them. China absolutely knows how vital Russia is to its existence, and it will do much more when the American threat grows.
China has enough sense of self-preservation where they have smoothed over tensions with India at this point, where
Yes,
the border disputes that existed there, the other disputes that existed there, have been at least shelved. I'm not saying they can't be revisited at some point in the future. I'm not saying that they won't reemerge. But at this point, China, realizing the reality of global politics, realizing what the balance of power is, know that going after India at this point is a fool's errand because that's just going to push the Indians into the arms of the Americans. And they formed a, think what you will of BRICS, they formed a pretty coherent economic bloc at this point, which is and like I promise I'll get into the Witkoff interview after this. But which is why you see the recent moves with Africa, which yes, in principle, I do support what Trump is saying about the Boers. I do support what he's
me
saying about the
too.
Afrikaners. I think it's one of the more redeemable things, and he did touch on this a little the first term. But I think it would be ignorant to pretend like there isn't a BRICS element here, where
Yeah, of course.
he is, like I said, as much as I like seeing a Western government support these people who should have been repatriated a long time ago, should have been repatriated 30, 35 years ago. And I blame particularly the British and the Dutch for not issuing passports to every Afrikaner. That, in my opinion, that was their responsibility, and if not theirs, some other Western nation needed to pick up that slack. But I mean, that's the past. There's nothing you can really do about it now. But right now, it does feel like we'll see how it plays out. But I do get the bad feeling the Afrikaners are being turned into the next Ukrainians, where they will be expected to suffer and die for the interests of the American empire and accomplish nothing for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. If anything, Trump bringing tariffs against South Africa will exacerbate the racial divide there,
Yeah, I
because
think
poverty always does this.
any situation when it comes to the South Africa racial issue, the South Africa ethnic issues, that involves calling out the racial problems there that doesn't involve a blanket asylum offer to all of them is pointless. You're only going to make the tensions worse. You're only going to increase violence. Like I said, at this point, and I don't know if we have any South African listeners, either in South Africa or abroad. You might not like the answer, but hey, I say the same thing to my own countrymen. I say the same thing to a lot of people in the West. There's no shame in an honorable exile, okay? At a certain point, you have every right to go wherever you'll be accepted and to rebuild life because at a certain point, things are just a lost cause. In South Africa, when it comes to the Afrikaner Project, when it comes to the Boers, when it comes to whatever political force they might have, maybe this is me speaking without enough information, but it is a lost cause. And if you want your people to survive in any form, you need to find somewhere else where they can build anew.
It's tragic. Um, their situation. Uh, the other thing I was going to say, just to steer the conversation back, but I appreciate that you went there with South Africa, is Putin had a sort of telecast, interview where he reiterated his commitment to BRICS, and we are not going back to Europe, not in any shape or form as it was before the war. So I think those were words that many people eagerly waited to hear from him, because it did. You don't know with him. You don't know if his naivete has finally been pierced or not. So, and I think that was also a message to the Trump team, that you're not going to split us from China. Like, if you want to escalate, okay, go ahead, escalate, but you're not going to do this. They well understand that if they bring back Russia into the fold and give them what they want in Ukraine, and China in the next 5 years is in dire straits, Russia is cooked. Europe will go for it. They'll find some other. It could be Belarus. It could be Kaliningrad. It could be some
The
false
Balts,
flag in Estonia
yeah.
or Latvia. But it'll be something like that, and that will reignite the war in Ukraine. It'll
Oh,
set up several fronts,
or at this
not
rate,
just one.
I don't want to speak too soon. Some of the developments in the Balkans could be that flashpoint,
Yeah.
as it has many times before, once again. Uh, because, I mean, if they were to seriously go full-throated regime change attempt in Syria, not Syria, they already did that, in Serbia, which at this point, yes, there is an effort, but it's not what one would expect. It's not the full-throated force of the American empire or even its European assets. That could lead to a situation where you see Bosnia, which is perpetually on the brink of collapse. So there's a lot that can be done here, and there is also always the favorite proxy of the Americans in the region, the Albanians. To my understanding, they're only getting more brazen. The Kosovo issue, you have that uh, new alliance between
The,
Kosovo, Albania, Croatia, and Bulgaria in order to
has
offset.
Bulgaria signed on?
I'm pretty sure the Bulgarians signed on. Correct me
I
if
know
I'm
they've been
wrong.
asked. I don't recall them giving an answer, but I know Croatia, Albania, and Kosovo have decided to create an alliance. Why?
And they've also invited uh, they invited Montenegro and I think Macedonia as well.
Yes, yes, I've
So
heard.
yes, form an alliance with the same people who are colonizing your countries as we speak. It's pathetic.
And
It's
and
ridiculous.
apparently Erdogan wants to entice the Macedonians to go on his side. So
Oh yes. So Erdogan, who's fighting off his own color revolution, can join in on the Great Balkan.
yeah, I
We're,
mean nothing. A lot may not even happen out of this,
yeah,
but it.
like I said,
I think the core premise of Croatia aligning with the Albanians is very real.
these are just
Uh,
machinations at this point. But in terms of as we're talking 5, 10 years down the road, if they do want to ignite something in Europe, these are certain flashpoints. They can do that. They can do that there. They can do that with Transnistria after the conclusion of the war in Ukraine with Moldova and Romania. Kaliningrad, the Baltics, Poland, and Belarus, and of course the Caucasus as well. Uh, there has been, of course, regime change attempts in Georgia. Azerbaijan is a perpetual thorn in the side of everyone, and the Armenians can't seem to pick a side. Pashinyan is trying to return himself to the embrace of Russia after all this time.
What an what a abysmal leader he has been.
Of course, at
Uh,
risk of Fed posting about a foreign country, I'll just say Armenian January 6th, when they stormed the parliament, I don't think I would have shed many tears if things went in a different direction.
yeah.
But with that being said, I think the thing that can segue all of this together and get into some of our Middle Eastern stuff is, did you listen to the Tucker Carlson Steve Witkoff
I
interview?
didn't I saw one or two clips. I saw people making commentary on it, but I haven't seen it yet.
It was good, and I'm not saying that in terms of like I think Witkoff, like, oh, he came out there and what he said, everything I agreed with, and I feel like we're in good hands. But I think it was a good summary of what the administration's current foreign policy is. And I'll get into some of the points that stuck out to me. It's not going to be an exhaustive takedown of it. I'm not going to play it bit by bit here. We'd be here all night. But with that being said, Tucker Carlson did what he usually does, which is sit back and let his guest talk, which has his advantages and his disadvantages. I feel like there were some times he could have pushed back. Same with the Putin interview, where he could have forced them to elaborate more, but
Yeah.
he opted not to. So the main takeaways, even though this was later in the interview, I'll start with it because it's more relevant to what we were just discussing. His position on Russia and Ukraine, he seemed to have nothing but praise for Putin, saying he's a smart guy. I met with him. I don't think he's a bad guy at all. Once again, that's all of what you'd expect. They're in active negotiations. He's not going to start insulting the man. He's smarter than that. But what he kept saying is, oh, this is my boss's policy, making it very clear that he is speaking not only for himself, but on behalf of the Trump administration. He's saying, this is our policy. I am a representative of the president, and we're doing what his agenda is. And he made some interesting comments around Ukraine, talking about the four regions where, yes, they did vote to join Russia. He didn't push back. He didn't question the referenda in the four oblasts that decided to secede and join Russia. He talked about what a great guy Putin was. He talked about after the assassination, and this could all be made up for all we know. I don't want to say one way or the other, but always take these things with a grain of salt. He said that when he met with Putin, one of the first things he told him is that after Putin heard about the assassination attempt in Trump, he prayed for his life and his survival on not only a political level but a personal level. Like I said, that could be just Witkoff fluffing the audience for all I know. But I did think that was interesting. He decided to include that because I wouldn't say he was necessarily trying to paint a very positive picture of Putin, but he was trying to humanize him in the sense of like, we're negotiating with this guy, and the last 10 years of making him into some devil walking the earth has been counterproductive. So there was that at least. Talked about the energy ceasefire, which was pretty funny listening to after the ceasefire fell apart. That was interesting, nonetheless. But in terms of his Middle Eastern policy, what I noticed even more than talking about anything with Israel and Palestine, of course, it was very biased towards Israel, but also he was saying like, "Oh yeah, I'm pro-Israel, but Hamas is a reality that we have to deal with," which was a major step forward from anything we've heard since the outbreak of the current Gaza war. So at least there's that. But what stuck out to me is he kept praising Qatar, and maybe praise isn't the right word, but he spoke very highly of Qatar, who are themselves overseeing a lot of the negotiating uh, towards the Russia-Ukraine issue, and saying that the Prime Minister of Qatar is a wonderful man, he's a man dedicated to peace, so on and so forth. The Qataris are a small, rich nation. They want to define themselves as somebody who can mediate global conflicts. I like the Qataris. They're good people. They have a lot to invest in the world. They want stability in the region so they can have foreign economic investment come in without underwriting the war risk, et cetera, et cetera. But I would certainly recommend anyone to listen to it on their own. Like I said, not because it's not me singing the praises of Witkoff, but I do think for an hour and a half it was a very concise summary of at least the public-facing Trump foreign policy. And if you want a greater insight into what's actually being done versus what's being said, I think it strikes the balance between the two. It gives you an idea of rhetoric, it gives you an idea of real action. And while, of course, we all know the real agenda, I am pretty sympathetic to the idea that they are dividing the labor between Europe and the United States when it comes to the different confrontations around the world. There does seem, at least, to be some more measured foreign policy. And that isn't the only side of the story, but it is slightly refreshing to see. And I would say it soothes over some tensions while also exasperating others. He talked about the Iranians talking about how, oh, we want to deal with Iran, of course, contingent on that they accept everything that Israel wants them to accept, naturally. But we want investment in the region. So, like I said, it was a very concise and frankly higher IQ version of a lot of the stuff Trump says, and I would recommend it to anyone. I don't think they discussed the Houthis at all, which we'll talk about, the restarting of the Yemen blockade over the Red Sea. But it was definitely interesting. I don't know what other word I would put to it, but I feel like when I listen to these interviews, it's usually hot air. But I feel like I actually walked away with something in this one. And I'm not even saying it's positive, and I'm not saying it's negative, but I walked away with something.
Hmm. Well, I mean, you've sold me. I'll definitely take a look at it.
But the one, probably the worst thing he said in all of that is, it was towards the end of the interview. They were talking about Israel's strategic position in the region, which was an actual acknowledgement of the fact that Israel is not invincible. It can't just dictate terms of the region. Now, of course, the United States will go to every length in order to make that as close to reality as possible. But there was an understanding that, like, oh yeah, we have to satiate Egypt and Jordan in some sense. But he was talking about Jolani, otherwise known as Al Shara. I don't want to dead name him or anything, but saying that, like, oh yeah, he may have been a leader of HTS, he may have had Al Qaeda affiliations, but people change. I wasn't the same person I was 10 years ago, and I mean, I was really hoping, like I said, it's just Tucker Carlson's interview style where he just kind of lets the guest speak free form, interjecting questions when necessary. But I was really hoping he would ask, but he didn't. Well, does that apply to former Al Qaeda members who are overseeing current massacres? Like, I mean, that was probably even beyond like the bog standard pro-Israel stuff. Probably the biggest ball drop of the interview as far as as far as everyone's concerned in that situation. I definitely want more elaboration on his comments there. But of course, what he fundamentally is saying, like, oh yeah, Assad is out of the picture, so Israel's in a much more comfortable position for the time being. That's what it came down to. But like I said, it's certainly an interesting listen. I would say the word I would use for it is it presented some transparency that I don't think anyone would have expected to say from any administration in a number of decades. Certainly not from the Trump administration, not from the first Trump administration, not from the Biden administration, not from Obama. But and maybe that was the point, to give the throw a bone to the people who want some transparency, some government official telling you just straightforward what the agenda is. And of course, there were some things that were offscade. There were some things that were twisted. There always is. But insofar as that's concerned, it's refreshing. And I do think a lot of it was, once again, a PR campaign in order to, what a lot of the Trump administration is doing, to restore some degree of faith in the institutions.
Yeah, I mean, let's see what happens. It's going to be interesting. I know April there's some decisions to be made by the West, but the big one is apparently King Charles is it's coming to America, and America will now be another realm of the British Empire.
Trump is going to reveal that ever since the Civil War, America has been a corporation owned by the City of London. He's going to crack it. He's going to crack it's true. He's going to cement it. He's going to formalize it. And imagine starting out to annex Canada and end up joining the British Commonwealth. Was this the power play all along? If he can't beat him, join him, because he knows that like he's going to be able to overpower every other country there. It will, or maybe wait. I got it. Trump wants to go down in history as the first prime minister of the United States. Who knows? It could be. The American the Dominion of America, the Dominion of Canada. Is this total Anglo victory? If so, this is not the world I want to live in. Or to quote that one woman, what's the point in life?
Yes. I mean, I think, joking aside, I think Charles is going to come to Washington to convince Trump to keep the war going, which I think he's divided on. I think there is a part of him that understands that he has to keep the war going, or he would interpret that as keeping pressure on Russia, right? He did not decide to just jettison this war and just say, that's it. I know how to stop this war. No more funding. Now, of course, I hear all kinds of rumors that the funding is winding down for the U.S., right? And they are preparing maybe for a much more extensive war, a direct war, maybe in Iran, maybe with the Houthis, but that again, to go back to Hexeth's comments in I believe it was January, that i- uh, there is a scarcity of means, and they will have to do that. So he hasn't been able to make that step, and the way that Britain and France, and I'm very sure King Charles, interpret that is that his mind can be changed because he hasn't shown, no matter how much he tries to charm Putin into accepting these unacceptable terms. Um, I mean, just the idea that you think you can charm Putin's ego is in and of itself hilarious. But in any case, as I said, that may be just for Western audiences.
Well, Trump does
It,
think
it,
everything's a real estate deal, so
yeah,
in
so
fact, to go back to Witkoff, he was somebody Trump knew from the real estate world. That's his only qualification, which, like I said, in terms of people who could be negotiating on behalf of the United States, there's worse out there, but I think we can all recognize the reality of the situation.
yeah.
But I suppose with all that being said, some of the things about a more direct war with Iran, and I'll get into some of the events in the Middle East, but I do want to just prime that with something we've been talking about, something other people have been talking about, which is this cultural shift they've been doing under Trump, the so-called putting away of the woke. And in many senses, I do see that happening right now. And you'll notice a lot of what's been coming out of the domestic side of the Trump administration has just been right-wing red meat. And I have to admit, on a gut instinct level, I like a lot of it. I think the most recent one was trying to abolish the Department of Education, which, contrary to the public opinion, is not getting rid of public schools. As much as I think that would probably just be a benefit at this point, it's just restructuring how national education is conducted in the United States, and it's shuffling around bureaucrats. That's really all it is. In which case, I do think it's a positive development in some senses. I think that it has been a conservative talking point since its establishment in the 1970s. But you see this, you see once again, a lot of the pushes, the Gulf of America thing, for example, but they are, once again, rebuilding faith in the institutions, rebuilding faith, making the right wing base, the average white guy who is of military age, feel like this is my country again. This is a country I would bleed for. And I think it's going to take quite a bit more than what's going on right now, but you see the pieces moving into place. Um, Donald Trump is certainly the figurehead of that. He is the archetypical American of that era, of like the 1980s businessman, like, oh, he's Donald Trump, his name's on everything. In many ways, J.D. Vance is also part of that. The rags to riches story, the poor kid who's now vice president and will probably be president one day. Hegseth, the young and energetic Secretary of Defense, like, oh yeah, I could see, like, I could fight under that man's command. Like, I wouldn't care. The
Hmm.
purging of people like Milley, taking his portrait down a few days after it gets put up in the Pentagon. You do see that happening right now, and even on some of the corporate side, where a lot of these places are quote unquote restructuring their DEI programs. Of course, these things aren't going away in their entirety, but you do see, like I said, a lot of Trump's domestic policy, which on just principle I can't complain about, has been nothing but right wing conservative and populist red meat. But there's a price
There's
tag.
a reason.
Yeah, there's a price tag attached to all that. Even like with a lot of the immigration stuff, which I do think in many ways has been underwhelming. It leaves some things to be desired, but one of the recent pushes is, oh, he's outsourcing American prisons to El Salvador. That's another point that really plays well with the conservative base that once I don't even necessarily oppose. And he's also deporting all those campus anti-Semites who are here on student visas as well. Like I said, it's all the stuff that these people would have wanted to see. It's all the stuff that Trump's base would have wanted to see, and all the stuff that people who recently came around to Trump wanted to see. They are, to borrow the very used phrase at this point, putting the woke away. But like I said, there is a price tag attached to that. One of the first things they did when they came into office is brag about how military recruitment was up 35,000 from whatever the last. I think they were measuring that by last year. And they also invited a lot of the people who were expelled from the military because of certain medical treatment statuses. And a lot of those people, I think, foolishly accepted. They were burned once by the system, but so desperate to get back in that they took the first opportunity that they got. And I have an immense amount of respect for the people who got that letter and tore it up and told them to piss off because you never did anything for me. I gave my life to you, and you, because I didn't accept this one ridiculous demand, threw me under the bus. So you guys can screw off. I have nothing but respect for those people. But a lot of them, either out of habit or foolishness, decided that, hey, now that the right guy's right in power, now that red team is in power, things are going to go that way. And in many ways, you can see they are gearing up for, if not an outright conflict, some sort of major escalation. And
Hmm.
I think maybe not necessarily directly with the Iranians, but as we see with Trump's operations ordered as of last week that we covered last episode, the Houthis. And the Houthis have reannounced their blockade on the Red Sea due to the breakdown in ceasefire talks with Israel. Because Israel did block aid going into Gaza, therefore the Houthis declared that if the Israelis are not going to honor the ceasefire, which once again that was a condition of it, that they were going to reinstitute the blockade of the Red Sea. So a lot of people were all on board saying we can't just let these terrorist groups blockade the Red Sea. But like, okay, let me just make the fairest argument I can here. I can understand and sympathize with the idea that yes, we are the guarantor of the global trade lanes because we are the largest navy, and that we screwed over everyone else after World War II out of sea patrolling navies. Okay, that's one thing. And I can understand, like, yes, military force against a group that is going to block a major trade route is justified. Okay. But the question is just, ceding the ground for the sake of argument to that side. I think the entire thing is foolish. I think it's ridiculous. I think considering just the direction of American foreign policy for the last 50 years, you'd have to be kind of a fool to take that at face value. But we are for the sake of argument. We have been either directly or indirectly fighting the Houthis since 2014. Whether that was via Saudi Arabia by advising and arming them in the Gulf states, whether it was by more direct action like you saw recently, like you saw at the end of last year with the Operation Guardian Shield, or whatever the hell it was, with the I think it was the Dutch who sent the one admiral that without a ship.
Yeah.
That great coalition, the Willing. Well, the thing is, we tried this. We ended up either blowing up empty warehouses or civilian targets, and the Houthis are not dislodged. They have not been dislodged in this long. Their missiles only get better. Uh, what is the plan? Unless these people who insist, and I can take them at face value, they don't want boots on the ground. That they want this just to be a limited military operation. Like I said, being as charitable to these people as I possibly can for the sake of argument, I can understand that. But at what point, unless you are willing to engage in a long, hard-fought counterinsurgency campaign, similar to what Iraq was, similar to the intervention against ISIS or Afghanistan, what is the plan in order to dislodge these people and open up the sea lanes? If you're
Yeah.
going to do it militarily and not diplomatically, because the simple
The
solution,
plan is very simple. Don't genocide the
yeah,
Palestinians.
well, I was about to say the plan,
It's
yeah,
very simple.
it
It's
is.
very simple.
Yeah, I would.
When there was a ceasefire, no ship was attacked. No American ship has been attacked. So it's very simple. It's very, very easy to understand. You're not going to genocide the Gazans. You're not going to you're going to stop that. I mean, even the stuff on the West Bank didn't provoke the Houthis to retaliate. But as soon as the bombing campaign resumed by Netanyahu, and now there's like over this week 700 dead. The first day, they say something like close to 400 dead. The number's now risen to 50,000 dead, most of whom are women and children. Yeah, I mean that's going to go on. It's gonna suck for you economically, but it's very simple. Just stop being a slave to Israel.
And
It's not hard.
you beat me to the punch. And what I was going to say to elaborate on that
Sorry.
point, no, it's fine. I would have done the same to you. Don't worry. I have before, as a matter of fact. But when it comes to, a lot of people will say, well, it's Israel. They have unchained control over the United States government. Yes, they do have a very heavy influence over the United States government, but we have shown in the past that we are very capable of yanking Israel's leash on a number of issues, okay? And we can get them a sweetheart deal. In fact, we did get them a sweetheart deal, but what did they do? They went and pushed the envelope further and further. No food aid to Gaza. Look, we bailed your ass out of this war. And I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they need to send somebody over here to say this, that there needs to be a Zelensky blow up with Netanyahu's cabinet, with Ben Gvir, with Smotrich, with all of them. That's the minimum I want to see out of this situation. But once again, as we see time and time again with American foreign policy towards Israel, Israel gets themselves into a mess that isn't going to destroy them, but they can't quite get out of on their own. We draw up a sweetheart deal, and what do? They throw it in the trash. And that's what happened again. Except now we are made to bear the consequences directly for it because of attacking on shipping. And frankly, what we're seeing right now when it comes to the Red Sea trade routes, it's actually Europe that's more reliant on those. So the European economy is taking yet another kick while it is already down. For the worst it's
Mhm.
been in decades. And the situation continues to be worse. And that is because the Zionists decide that we need a few more inches of the Gaza Strip, and that's worth plunging the entire global economy into the toilet. And it's worth risking a world war. And we keep signing blank checks over to these people. And like I said, it's not as easy. I shouldn't say it's not like we can completely cut Israel off. There's too many interests tied up there. But it is fully, even within this administration's capacity, to take Netanyahu in the back room and say this is not going to happen. Because, look, I know for a fact, and I think anyone who knows anything about the American regime change apparatus, even after the quote unquote abolition of U.S. aids, we have the ability to color revolution Netanyahu. He's under immense domestic pressure right now. There are still the legal issues against them. They've been shelved ever since October 7th, but there are ways. There are opposition figures in Israel. I mean, if Trump can meet with Poroshenko and Timoshenko, he can meet with Bennett and Lapid and whoever that other one is, the more quote unquote moderate liberal one. There are mechanisms to make this ceasefire happen if the administration wants it to, which would free up the Red Sea. And like I said, uh, the Houthis, as we saw during the initial phases of the ceasefire, didn't honor that. We did not have uh, ships from, I guess, what you could call pro-Israel countries fired upon in that 3 month period. But we're back to that situation right now, and our options are we tell Israel to honor the damn agreement we got for them, or we commit to a boots on the ground campaign because there's no other way. And with some of the developments, both in terms of American domestic policy in order to regain the confidence of the institutions, in terms of American military policy, we very well could see a situation where I'm not saying it's going to be a huge war. I'm not going to say they're going to have to draft anyone, but we could see maybe an Afghanistan-sized war in Yemen. Maybe it won't go that far, but we could see, at least in my opinion, a Syrian-sized war in Yemen.
I mean, Trump is really getting himself in a pickle, but I suppose he always knew that this would inevitably happen because, he can talk about being the peace president, but the mechanisms he had in place to achieve all that he wanted and still remain the peace president are just not workable. I mean, we're just not in that world anymore. We weren't even in that world in 2017, let alone in 2025. That's ultimately the problem. And speaking of the Middle East, of course, you have now Israel asking Russia to stay in Syria to offset the Turks, right? Um, Now, the
That's only the second most ridiculous demand this week. The first one coming from Jelani himself, which is
yeah, in case I have this wrong, confirm it for me. Is Jelani not already ceding territory to Israel right now, on an official basis
on an
after
official basis.
complaining?
I'm not sure, but I know that his priority right now is the extradition of Assad.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's because that's really important.
Yeah, and I mean what that is, we all know. Of course, public opinion shifts the wind, even in places like Syria. So even marginal Assad supporters now hate him. So if Jelani can bring him back, put him on trial, and execute him, that would be great for his approval rating.
It's so ludicrous, right?
But then everyone will forget about that in 3 weeks, and we'll be back where we started, where Syria is tearing itself apart, and it can't be ignored. But as far as I know, yeah, there were talks about some sort of ceding of territory with Israel, but we'll see how that actually plays out. This is the man whose war name was after the Golan Heights, that they were going to take it back from the Zionists. They were going to support the Palestinian cause, and I mean, I knew this would happen if Assad ever fell, and I thought it was much more unlikely in the past, but it it's undeniable right now that
Yeah.
that without Assad, the Palestinian movement, I'm not saying it's over, but look at what it is now. And perhaps part of the reason they're violating the ceasefire is because the Iranians have been set back significantly. And while there was some activity in Latakia, the massacres have stopped really any.
No,
Uh,
they have not stopped.
the massacres have not stopped, but any sort of revolutionary sentiment from the people being massacred, for obvious reasons, has stopped because they can't step out
Hmm.
in the street without being killed. A lot of them are still taking refuge within Russian bases, and that situation has not been resolved. And yeah, but Jelani's primary concern right now is the extradition of Assad.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a time waster. All he's doing is appealing to his base. They're in the middle of a bloodbath that has been going on for 2 weeks, and so they think like, I know what will satiate you guys. I bring back Assad, and you get to kill him the way you've killed all these other people. Like, also there are very bad takes, about like, oh well, this was going to happen in Syria because of the Alawites are a minority. Like that's true to an extent, but something like 65% of the population or more is Sunni. You think all the 10% of the Syrian military that fought these guys for 14 years, you think they're Shia or they're Alawites? No, they're not. The
No,
vast majority were Sunni.
yeah, and that's the
They're
that's the
they're
point.
Sunnis who don't want Jelani.
Yeah, and that's the point I had made about Syria in our last couple episodes, where
Yep.
there's a lot of Sunnis who enjoyed living in a modern functional society that Assad created, that Assad and his father created, and that there's a lot of them who, and that's why I was insistent on using the term Salafist, because I think
Yes.
uh, or Wahhabi, that's the other one, where it does paint a more precise picture. And like I said, that's not even out of some necessarily like great love for Islam. I think everyone knows the religious views of both you and I in the program itself at this point. But
Yes.
just for the sake of honesty and the sake of accuracy, a lot of just run of the mill Sunnis who I wouldn't necessarily want to live next to were very functional and non murderous people. But it is these particularly Salafists, these people from Idlib, these people who followed Jelani, who are out in the streets massacring everyone. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them do get pressured to go along just because that is the regime narrative. That's just how power works. Not necessarily protect themselves, but just accept that's the reality of the situation. But you're right. The majority of Assad's army, the ones fighting ISIS, the ones fighting Al Qaeda, were Sunni themselves.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
most of the, and not to downplay the current massacres, but you look at how ISIS and Al Qaeda have conducted themselves. It's mostly them massacring other Sunnis for being insufficiently Sunni.
Yes, yes. And maybe the only bit of good news I've heard from Syria was today there have been Sunni Muslims who have asked for the massacres to stop. These are just everyday people.
Yes, just
Now,
the
I don't know how the Jelani regime is going to react. Of course, the Jelani regime is emboldened to do this because there are no consequences, much like Israel, right? Some of the sanctions have been lifted. Money has been given to the regime from the EU because there's no consequences. They've wanted this to happen for a very long time because the primary interest now is obvious. It's not some stupid pipeline from Qatar, it's for Israel.
yes, yes, and now Israel has to deal with the Turks on their doorstep, and we'll get into some of the news about Erdogan. But I was actually thinking about this back in, I think it was 2019, something that was very prescient, or I suppose had a lot of foresight behind it. Was actually an interview back when McGregor was a regular guest on Tucker Carlson's Fox News show.
Hmm.
One of the things he said, particularly about the situation with Israel and Syria, is that Israel needs to find a way to coexist with his neighbors, in his words, because we could be looking at a situation in the next decade where Turkey is their primary adversary.
And I think that's a great segue because I think that's what Israel is afraid of right now.
Yeah, and that's why they're begging the Russians to stay to offset the Turks, who they practically invited into Syria. And I mean, at this point, thinking back to what Syria looked like since 2020, Assad had reconciled with the Arab League. He had reconciled with the Gulf states, who themselves have plenty of back-channel communications with Israel. He had he hadn't cut off, but he had distanced himself significantly from the Iranians, and it was still within the decision of Israel, of course, conducting it through the United States, who conducted it through the Gulf states and Turkey, to get rid of Assad. And now they get to deal with a Turkish proxies down their border at a time where anti-Israel sentiments among Muslims worldwide is at an all-time high. So, while Israel isn't in a dire situation, it's not in a comfortable position, and a lot of that is its own doing. Uh, because not only on top of their response to October 7th, they decided they needed a complete state collapse in Syria and allowing an Al Qaeda affiliate to take over. And what once bought them breathing room, and in many ways still does buy them breathing room, has created a potentially worse problem now.
Hmm.
And I do have to say, with the situation in Turkey, it is. I don't want to see more collapse, instability, and violence, especially that will spill over into Europe, because it will. If Erdogan it collapses, if there's a collapse of the Turkish state, which is already economically fragile as it is. So, just as principle, for the sake of stability and human life, I do not want that to happen. But I would be lying if I didn't take a certain level of satisfaction in the fact that the same kind of revolutions Erdogan helped foment in Syria, and the same kind of campaigns he undertook in the Caucasus, are coming home.
Mm.
But I suppose unless you have any more about Israel, I'll get into the situation with the protests in Turkey.
Yeah, let's move to Turkey.
So the incident that kicked off this recent round of protests, on top of just prolonged economic instability, it all boiled over with the arrest of, it was either the mayor of Istanbul or Ankara, I believe it was Istanbul, Ismet Ingalu, who was at one point, I also believe, a presidential hopeful. And he has been, at least in recent years, billed as the main political rival of Erdogan. If anyone can beat him in an election, it was going to be Ingalu. I'm probably botching the pronunciation of his name, but it's a Turkish name, so I only care so much. And he was arrested on what appeared to be very dubious charges. Once again, it was the typical anti-corruption campaign that was used to sweep away your political opponents. We see this all over the world. We see this in Romania. We see this in Ukraine. We even tried. We even saw an attempt at this in the United States with Trump last year. But it comes back where the people flood to the streets, and in a much bigger revolution or color revolution than I say what we've seen in Serbia, what we've seen in Slovakia, what we've seen in Romania, Georgia.
Some people are saying 1 million people.
I, judging by some of the aerial footage, I can believe it. And this is particularly Ankara and Istanbul. It's being seen in, but also in other cities throughout Turkey. And Erdogan did not hesitate to use. It was not lethal force, but he did not hesitate to use force against protesters: water cannons, rubber bullets, the typical anti-riot measures you take. Much more forceful than some of these other countries facing color revolutions at the moment. And the question to what color revolution might not exactly be the right word for it, but I mean, a lot of these things are top down. We can all acknowledge that. Very few of these things are organic and or spontaneous. But I do wonder. Of course, it does come at a time when Turkey and Israel are feuding, so there is interest there. But I do wonder where the source of this is. I don't think this is coming directly from the State Department or CIA or even the streamlined U.S. aids, which was rolled under the State Department, as we know. While there was some setbacks, and while I can appreciate that, the program it was streamlined, to use the word once again. Sorry if I'm repeating myself here, for the sake of making it more efficient for future regime changes. So we could see that underway right now. However, like I said, it is a very precarious situation. Turkey might be a militarily powerful country, it might be a NATO country, and it might be a very stable country as far as for its neighborhood. But as I said, it has had prolonged economic instability. It has a large foreign population. It has ethnic tensions. Think of the Kurds at this point, and it also is in a geopolitical hotspot between Syria, Iraq, the Caucasus, the Black Sea, where I'm not saying Turkey would collapse in the civil war, but you could see a profound collapse in state institutions. Maybe not all of them, maybe not like a lawless society, but you could see the situation in Turkey turn very ugly very quickly if these protests continue and if there is any sort of success against Erdogan. Pretty much anything that isn't a an Erdogan victory where he staves this off, or a bloodless transfer of power where they convince him to leave and put in some transitional government. Uh, it could get very messy. Civil life in Turkey could grind to a halt, and we could see yet again, both from the Turkish population themselves and the foreign population, think mostly Syrian refugees, try to leave Turkey, and at that point they would likely try to head into Europe because that's where the next center of, I guess, economic prospects is, as far as they're concerned.
Right. Now, I think in some ways, if we follow the events chronologically, we can figure out what might be going on. Erdogan was reelected, wasn't it last year?
2023, after the earthquake.
2023, sorry, right after the earthquake. Now, an election is due in 2028. Uh, So why is Erdogan trying to get rid of him? Now, the first telltale sign was that he revoked Ingulu's university degree. And of course, if you don't have a university degree in Turkey, you can't run for president, you can't be a high-ranking politician, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the first clue. 2 days later, he's arrested. What I presume are trumped-up charges, and going after the university degree is a way of him delegitimizing him as even the mayor of Istanbul. And Istanbul is huge. Of course, I was there in late 2023. Uh, how big is it? It's bigger than Moscow.
And Yes, I understand it straddles continents, but it is technically the largest city in Europe.
Yeah, it's like 14 million people minimum, minimum. Um, it is massive. So this is no small thing. Um, of course, the east side, the Asian side of Istanbul, is where you see a lot of the liberal protests, the feminist protests, etc. And it is the old Istanbul where you have a lot of the traditionalists.
So
There's the
Constantinople remembers a part of Europe, Europa,
yeah.
Europa. Uh, I sorry, I
Look,
had to.
yeah, I know, that's fine. Now, where I was staying was a short 10-minute walk from like one of the most traditional areas. You a lot of Central Asians in this area. These are not like, the more Mediterranean looking Turks. These are like Central Asian types, where they were staying. And and part of the reason there's been this transformation that has taken place in Istanbul, and of course, uh, Erdogan is responsible for turning the Hagia Sophia back into a mosque. Um, Although it's still like very much a tourist attraction, he did do that, and I'm sure at their behest. And of course, he organized them to do this. And at one time, Erdogan himself was the mayor of Istanbul, and he too was ousted at one point. So this is back in the 90s, by the way. So why so soon? Like, why now? That's what I find interesting. I- is Erdogan healthy? One would have to surmise. Is he going to be running? Does he have someone that he's already interested in?
Well, I
Like,
can't
why
recall,
why act now?
but did they ever get the constitutional amendment to let him run again?
Not yet.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
But don't you think it's strange? Like,
Yeah, I do think it's jumping the
we're still
gun.
3 years away from the next election. Like, isn't this soon?
Yeah, I mean the only thing I could see the two things, yes, I think the questions about his health and his longevity in office is another one, and then also the question about the economic situation. You could see a potential vote of no confidence against the parliament and the cabinet and the prime minister, where although Erdogan would not be unseated, the people directly under him could resemble much different composition that is not favorable to his agenda, as we see in a lot of these semi-presidential systems and a lot of these mixed systems with the president and the parliamentary system. So that might be it. Maybe he's anticipating another parliamentary election. I don't know when their next scheduled one is. I'll look up when their next legislative election is right here if you have anything uh, to add to that.
Um, whatever other foreign state actors might be involved in all of this, this is still primarily an unforced error on the part of Erdogan. Um, it is none of this would have happened. Like, I will say this about Turkey: there are complaints that the standard of living isn't that great. Economically, they're not doing that well, and they haven't been doing that well for many years. Um, so there is discontent and unhappiness. I wouldn't say it's at the same level as, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa. As some indexes show that they're actually happier than even people in India. But in any case, I mean, say what you will about Turkey, but they're better at running their state than the Indians are. In
Oh
any
yeah,
case,
absolutely. Like I said, despite my personal biases on both a contemporary and a historical level against the Turkish state, I've never let that cloud my judgment of the fact that Erdogan is a very competent man, and the
yeah,
Turkish state is traditionally a very strong institution, especially with the formation of the republic. And I did look it up. The parliamentary elections coincide with the presidential elections, so those aren't until 2028. But once again, we do have a situation where there could be a collapse in government, vote of no confidence. These things happen all the time in these kind of systems, where
right.
it's not like in the United States where there is fixed terms. If there is a resignation, they're replaced either by appointment or by a runoff election, where If Trump were to drop like a fly tomorrow or were to resign, we would have Vance throughout the rest of the term. We wouldn't reorganize elections in 30 days. And think what you will about that system, but I think a lot of people, maybe not necessarily people who listen to this show, but a lot of people get that in the mindset if they do live in the United States, where terms are fixed regardless of candidate, and that there is no snap elections, there's no runoff elections, where in most other countries there is. So I think that's another possibility. They could be anticipating a runoff in terms of because of
Hmm.
current economic and political issues. So he's trying to preempt that. But I mean, ultimately, we'll see how that ends up playing out. And I think,
There is some kind of voting taking place right now. Like Imamoglu has apparently received 14.9 million votes so far, with 2,600 ballots still not counted. Now, I don't know if this, because there were rumors that, well, not rumors, but I saw some reports saying that they're going to have like an unofficial election. Now, how would they do this? I don't know. I admit I know nothing about Turkish politics. So if somebody knows in the chat, but that was news that just came out today. The other thing I wanted to say was, um, a lot of people, after they heard of the horrors, want to put all the blame on the Turks. They deserve blame in the most extreme. Don't get me wrong, but like this is an example of why Turkey could never have funded HTS without American back
oh,
channels.
absolutely. And
Like, Turkey just does not have the ability to pay these guys for that many years. Like, no.
I said this when I was talking to you. Tel Aviv gives the directive. It goes to Washington. Washington sends plenty of its own money, cajoles the Gulf states into giving the rest, and then it's all distributed through
Yep.
Turkey. And Turkey
Yep.
gets to pick and choose who it wants to get the aid. It gets to make the more immediate
Yep.
decisions, similar to the Pakistani role in the Soviet war in Afghanistan, where the Pakistanis had a very large role in picking and choosing who got the aid. That's where Bin Laden came from, actually. But like I said, it all, of course, comes from a combination of Washington and Tel Aviv, who lean on powers in the region, of course, appealing to their own interests to cooperate in these projects.
Yeah. Very well put.
And I'm I'm actually a bit shocked by this because I knew that the Turkish economy was quite weak. I think, for lack of a better word, but I didn't expect this level of discontent, especially after the. I'm not saying it was overwhelming, but the comfortable election victory Erdogan got. It wasn't really close. It was competitive, but he was the clear winner. The only thing that made me reconsider that was the earthquake, which at that point the crisis was managed well enough in order to stave that off. But these do feel like they did come out of nowhere. I understand that they didn't, but I didn't think the tensions would quite boil over like this. And this could just be a flash in the pan. These people could calm down. There could be some concessions made, or they could press this issue further. And I think if they press this issue further, depending on how far it goes, we'll have an idea of whether this is just popular discontent, which I don't think is likely in the first place, or whether this is a more concerted effort against Erdogan, which I know that, of course, there still is a deep state. Contrary to popular belief, Trump did not smash the deep state, and that they still do have a lot of independent capabilities to act uh, without the president's knowledge or consent. But I don't think this was directed that would have came from, for example, the United States under the Trump administration, because Trump has a decent working relationship with Erdogan. I think he has enough to lean on him in order to get him to cooperate on a number of issues. But for all, it could be coming from the Europeans who themselves are economically strapped, but would have some capital in order to make something like this happen. And of course, Israel would want this to happen. But this does seem short notice for Erdogan's recent pivot against Israel to the time of the color revolution. These things usually take more time to coordinate if that is what's happening, and that might be the direction it ends up taking. But it I can anticipate some things. I'm not going to pretend like I predicted everything. I know that's kind of a joke we make on the show, but this did come out of left field for me. I was not expecting this one,
Hmm.
and like I said, it could be one of those things where this dissipates rather quickly. But this is certainly a situation I want to keep my eye on because this could have severe ramifications not only for say Europe and the Middle East, but globally. I mean, we're talking about, to use the word once again, the geopolitical center of the world. It is Anatolia. It is Asia Minor. It is modern day Turkey. And a crisis there has a potential to rapidly spread in all directions. North up to the
Hmm.
Black Sea, this could have ramifications in the Russian-Ukraine war potentially. In a much more immediate sense, certainly in the Caucasus, definitely in the Middle East. We see what's happening in Syria right now, and of course in the Balkans, where the Turks are trying to get in on this bizarre coalition forming in the region. But we'll ultimately see how it plays out. And as far as I know, Erdogan has enough state institutions on his side to weather this change, and yeah, I think the situation would have to be pretty bad in order to have them betray him. And now I could be misinterpreting the situation here, but that's to my general understanding of the situation. But he's a man with a long list of enemies. If this is a concerted effort, it could come from a lot of different directions.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see this coming, and but now the longer this goes on, obviously, it isn't just about Erdogan's grip on power. Um, like I say, I think it's very early for him to be doing these kind of antics. And if that's the case, then he's paranoid about something. There's something else to this. But for the people protesting, there is something else that's even more than, um, this potential challenge. It's that they're not happy with, with the state of the economy. Um, and I think that's what's like. I think a lot of the anger is just that. It's that life is not that great. What I'm worried about most of all is, they keep reiterating that. How do you pronounce his name? Imagalu.
To my
Like,
understanding, yes.
is that he's a Kemalist, so he's going to be more secular. But I could very well see that for instance, that the Americans and probably the British as well would like to have a Turkey that is more anti-Russia,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
I don't know if Imagalu is the kind of guy that would be, but I know that Kemalists have been, generally speaking, more anti-Russia. They've been generally more compliant with the Americans. They might even think that um, they can get aid money from the Americans if they were. Right? That's something to think about. Now, the problem is, and this is kind of funny because both the Ayatollah Khomeini said in 2022 that Erdogan would pay a price for what happened for his support of the Salafists in Syria. And I believe in January or December, Alexander Dugin said that he had committed a sin and that he would pay the ultimate price for it, and that neither Iran nor Russia would rescue him. And that seems plausible. Even if he comes out of this, um, he's probably not going to get reelected in 2028. He might even do something crazier because that's still 3 years away.
And that's all assuming the Constitution is even amended to allow him to run again.
That's right. That's right.
Or it could be one of those situations where one of his
That
guys
itself
isn't.
could be another
Yeah.
trigger. That
It,
itself could be another trigger because I think these protests basically are saying you cannot run in 2028. And unless he, look, everybody was surprised in 2023 that he got reelected, particularly after the earthquake. And the earthquake, of course, affected both Syria and Turkey, but Turkey far worse than Syria. And ironically, it affected more of the areas that the Turks had taken over, that some of the Kurds had occupied, and also the Salafists in Idlib. Kind of ironic, but we'll see where this goes. I could see the West capitalizing on this. I could see them wanting to push the crowd more in order to have somebody that's more favorable to them. But I could also see the Russians, not caring one way or the other, because he is such a scumbag, and he might have run out of luck.
It, it could be just that the man who snakes everyone gets snaked himself. And
Yeah.
it was almost inevitable. There's only so long you can play that game. Sure, you can have outreach to the other side, you can be on good terms to the other side, but the level of flip flopping Erdogan did, it garnered him too many enemies. The
Hmm.
Americans certainly want him gone. We saw that with Obama. One of his last foreign policy actions was the coup in Turkey. The Russians aren't eager to bail him out. He's been a very unreliable partner in that regard. The Iranians don't want him. The Gulf states don't like him. And it may be that he has pressed his luck with just about everyone, and it, now it's time to go. Which
Yeah.
I think is probably most likely, and we'll see how much if he can serve out his term or what happens with that. And we could see a situation like we saw in Israel before October 7th, where he does pursue this constitutional amendment, and it leads to just complete civil unrest where the people want him gone. The courts are after him. As we see with these sort of efforts to consolidate power, it could lead to a profound backlash. And
Mm.
it the Kemalists, to my understanding, are very pro-Western, even going back to Kemal himself, very pro-Western, and they would want to continue the path of European integration, which was always a joke for Turkey, but even at this point, it's even more of a joke. But there's probably enough of an underclass, or underclass isn't the right word, but undercurrent, I suppose I should say, of pro-Western Turks who want that direction for the country and who think that they're slipping backwards in Erdogan, and all of the rural bumpkins he brought in and moved to the city are ruining the country. That could have been a great powerhouse of the West, and of course, in order to do that, we need to align ourselves with the United States and Europe, which means full-throated support for Ukraine, which means we're pro-Israel, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But that is all I had for that. And I suppose as we're winding down to the end of the show, we can talk about some of the revelations in the JFK files, which you went through them much more thoroughly than I did, so I'll let you take the wheel here.
Yeah. So, first off, what I'm going to say is, if you subscribe to Rye Dawson, you should. You can find him on Rumble. I don't know, but I don't think he has a YouTube channel. Ryan Dawson has been banned many, many times, even during the Obama years. I've been following him for a very long time. He was even a guest on this show.
Yes, a
What,
number
about
of years ago. Yeah,
yeah, 5, 6
2019, I
years ago?
think.
Yeah, 2019. I was away at that time, but um, I like what he said, because I think one of the things, the primary revelation of these files is that Israel killed JFK. That's it. That's the big mystery. Essentially, JFK was killed by the Israelis. And one of the superb things that he said in his dialogue with Patrick Henningsen of 21st Century Wire, and you can find 21st Century Wire on YouTube. It's a long interview, or discussion, I should say, podcast, but it is very, very good. And what Ryan said was, if they can assassinate your president, they can make you complicit in a genocide. Right now, obviously, like, there's, I mean, his research is really unparalleled. I really want to stress that. So, for instance, you're always going to run into comments in our spheres, comments on YouTube videos, maybe, or Twitter or Telegram. But he has a fuller picture. Like, for instance, there's a part where the Italian mafia is saying that the Jews are on board with this. What they mean by that is the Israelis. Okay. So there was a Jewish mafia, of course, and there was also an Italian mafia. And they eventually merged, particularly around the time they started running drugs. But before that, which was very lucrative for the CIA, and the thing about all these organizations are like ISIS and Al Qaeda. They work with intelligence all the time. And they have all kinds of, dupes who are not, are only semi-competent, but they're not like that competent because they have mental issues that can be used for certain projects, let's say. um so yes, lots of revelations. For instance, I mean, all kinds of stuff that like is out in left field, like stuff you wouldn't expect,
In
like
terms of CIA proxies, because you brought it up, one of the other ones that came out that's been just common knowledge but was confirmed now is that the Mormons in Utah, their institutional church is pretty much an organ of the CIA, especially their missionary trips, which they go all over the world with
yes,
those. That they and we saw this with some of the quote unquote anti-religious discrimination in post-Soviet Russia, where Russia banned a lot of these very bizarre Protestant and at some point even non-Christian churches who were trying to
because yeah,
because
Jehovah
yeah,
Witnesses, Baptists, like
yeah, they were
the
directly
yeah,
tied into American intelligence.
yeah. So one of the crazy ones that I had no clue about, that was released, was um, the CIA put contaminating agents in Cuban sugar that was headed for the Soviet Union. Another one, uh, uh, see, so again, contaminating agents. Sorry, no. Historian William Blum also documented how the CIA supported former Nazis who poisoned um, cow milk in socialist East Germany put soap and powdered milk as a mean that was headed for school children. Right. This is part of the whole Gladio thing, right? Because there were all kinds of Gladio operations where people got shot up like at a summer fair or at a supermarket repeatedly. Never been caught. No robbery either, right? Some of the ones around Italy are more famous, but
Yeah, the years of lead, very that needs a deep dive in and of itself. But if you have the
yeah.
chance to look into it, very telling things there.
The other thing that Ryan said that I thought was really prescient was, uh, a lot of these files were already released in 92, and another batch was released in 1997. He was also partly responsible for the release of some of these files that are unredacted, right? Um, so when you think of the Kennedy assassination, right, maybe a way to look at it is, you have several parties that are involved, but ultimately, the point of it was to get nuclear arms to Israel. And the guy that was the most responsible, and that these files reveal, is um what's his name? I'm trying to find his name. Jesus is, James Jesus. Please forgive me. I have to get better organized. So, basically, the central figure in this, and there's more than one, is a guy named Angleton, James Jesus Angleton. James Jesus Angleton is the man in these files who is responsible for taking uranium out of Pennsylvania, uh, and it was not far from Butler, Pennsylvania, and giving it um, to to the Israelis. And I'm gonna send you this. So this is a picture of him. Obviously, he was a younger man than you see in the photo when he did what he did. Um, the Israelis have only two monuments or plaques or commemorations for non-Israelis, and one of them is this guy, Angleton. There's a park that was named after him, but I also found, sorry, a forest, but I also found like a corner with a plaque. That's another one. I'll show it to you. Of course, they had um, a memorial for him after he died. The other guy, of course, is Maxwell. You know, Ghislaine's father. Yeah, that guy. um,
Wonderful man, I hear.
Wonderful man, wonderful man. So that's who. That's now the other person. So those are the two. Robert Maxwell. There was a book written by him by about him by Gordon Thomas, Israel's super spy. I mean, of course, he's like, uh, a dual loyalty to the nth degree. Um, but there was another guy that was involved in the actual transference of the uranium. I think it was like 300 grams. Just looking for the file.
Yeah, I was out of the facility in Pennsylvania. I remember that. Um,
Yes.
and uh, yeah, I can't remember his. It's escaping me right now. But even before the files
Yeah.
came out, there were some
So
pretty good
the
deep dives on this.
So this FBI on Zalman Shapiro, the Jewish infiltrator that worked with the CIA to divert 300 kilograms of uranium from the U.S. to Israel, perfectly illustrates why they cannot be trusted. The Stu Peters on X, Jews never have and never will be loyal to their host nation, is what he wrote. Um, Yes, I'm trying to. So it was another figure. Sorry, it was not. Zalman was responsible for organizing it, but it was a different character that actually brought the uranium over, and of course that went to Dimona nuclear facility. The French built that for them, and then they tried to lie to the Americans. The Israelis did that this was some kind of like agricultural thing, that it was completely unbelievable. And of course, LBJ was completely compromised by Zionists. And of course, as soon as Kennedy was assassinated, literally within a week, the war goes on. I know Ben Gurion, who was, essentially a terrorist. The first prime minister of Israel was a terrorist. He was in Irgun, like the Stern gang. They committed all kinds of terrorist acts. And anyway, so that's the leadership of Israel at the time. Now, Ben Ben Gurion did like resign as a kind of a protest against the Americans, because essentially he'd been found out. And then of course, he took back that office as soon as Kennedy was assassinated. Anyway, so I urge everybody, go to 21st Century, and you'll find them on YouTube. You can find them on Telegram. I don't know if Patrick Henningsen is still banned on X, but you can get the Rye Dawson, and you can find them on Rumble as
Yeah,
well.
Rumble.
And Rye Dawson did come out with he has made a short film from a few years ago, and it's all about what we're talking about now. But he was already on the ball years ago. It's called Numec, 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 and you'll find it on Rumble if you just look into it. So that's what I had for the JFK files. And It's fun. Today at church, the young guys already started making jokes about this. Oh boy.
Yeah, hey, it,
It-
it's just undeniable at this point.
it's undeniable.
And while there were some revealing things in this, the only thing I'll say, because I think you gave a pretty good summary of what was worth talking about, is it just was concrete evidence of a lot of stuff that was public knowledge beforehand. And
Yeah.
this is what you can point to if somebody tells you you're just making this up, you're being a schizo about it. No, it's right there. It's in plain English mostly, and I will certainly be interested to see where this goes. If there's any more deep revelations, because it was like 80,000 pages. There's people just scouring through this all over the place, and what I thought was, oh boy, I'll have to share that. but but uh, what I thought was interesting is the only thing they tried to redact, which obviously failed given the recent information, is they tried to redact stuff, of course, about Israel. But I'll put this headline.
It's so good. It's so good.
So, uh, this is the entire like centrist movement post October 7th, just as a primer for what I'm about to put on screen here. I hate Trump for America. I love Trump for Israel.
Wow. It's just
I
not enough power. It's
I,
not
I,
enough power.
I love this rhetoric, especially in light of the fact that Biden gave the biggest American aid package to Israel in history, larger than all the other ones.
Mm.
Biden did not spare a thing for them.
Yeah.
And what they kept doing, what they kept insisting is we need Trump back because Biden is a Hamas sympathizer.
It's insane. Just
No,
because
no,
he gave him everything else but the 2,000 pound bomb.
yes.
Blump. I mean, I think this is why I'm convinced that they want some kind of wider war with Iran. They want a solution to Iran. I think that was Biden's red line. And let's not forget that Bush Jr. had more moral integrity than even Biden and Blinken, obviously. What are you going to expect out of Blinken? But
I come here first as the Jew, second as the American Secretary of State.
yeah,
And
exactly.
that's not me being inflammatory. That's not me being prejudiced. That is a real
That's just
quote.
your. That's a real quote.
But yeah, even Bush Jr. knew where to draw the line, and they do want the Iranian question solved. And I know that Iran has its own internal issues. We talked about this on our year-end, beginning of year show, where of course Netanyahu's out there making the plea to the Iranian public. Oh, we love the Iranian people. You just got to get rid of those mullahs. That's the line over and over again. Of
Yeah,
course,
yeah,
Israel
yeah.
would never stop once they got their desired regime change. If Iran showed any inkling of sovereignty that didn't align with Israel, it could be the most secular, rainbow flag waving, pro gay, pro woman government. But if they kept those nuclear plants online, even for domestic energy, they would be constantly threatened with bombing. It simply doesn't matter. And I do fear, however, with some of the internal exasperation with the government in Iran on the ground level, that a lot of people might take Netanyahu at his word, foolishly, but they might take him at his word because there is real issues of discontent that goes beyond half-naked women dancing in the streets in Iran. There are real
Hmm.
economic issues. There are
Yep.
real social issues. I never want to downplay those, and we could see that reach critical mass, especially now with the Ayatollahs, Khomeini. It's an ossified regime, and I'm not saying that they're impotent. I'm not saying they're incompetent, but they're dinosaurs. I'm sorry, there's no other way around it.
Mm.
In many ways, they're not in touch with the reality of the situation. And then to compound that problem, you have Pezeshkian, who is a very weak man. Let me find the quote from from him this week. You know what I'm talking about. Uh, let me. Many things are happening. So many things are happening at once. Sometimes I have no idea what's going on. That came from Pezeshkian this week. It,
There are people still blaming Russia for this. Like he made it impossible.
it is Putler's fault. It's always
Oh,
Putler's fault.
this is the idiot. This is the idiot. Okay, before we go, I have to send you this. This is the idiot with the stupid oxygen mask. Like, just look at this guy, dude.
So let me just
Don't you mean Krasnov's PPT?
yeah, that hold on, let me get this up. It's being uncooperative, but yeah, this is I think this sums up everything that we've been saying about Agent Krasnov. He's a danger to American national security. It's a real problem. And I'm glad that there's brave people out there who are holding the line against him because what else would we do? Uh, there we go. Does the Kremlin have compromise? Yeah, yeah, they love to throw in like the Russian words that they don't know what it means that they mispronounce. Like they love the Russian
Yes.
buzzwords, and that's another one. Compromat. I I my Russian is terrible. It's something I've tried for years to learn and kind of hit a brick wall with. It's just one of those things. But like this is just pathetic. And then of course it's that thumbnail. It's great. You know what? There's an uncanny resemblance to Zelensky there. I'm gonna get that off my screen. Or maybe I'm just looking too much into this. But yeah, that was. Yeah, what a guy. What a guy.
You watch one video and this guy suggested to you all the
Yeah,
time.
it's one of those channels that the algorithm eats up for obvious reasons. And also,
Yep.
if anyone asks, you do not hear about him from us.
Yeah. You better you guys better shut up.
You just stumbled upon him. Okay, that's.
Yeah.
But was there any other last minute pressing things that we need to cover?
Probably, but I
Yes,
can't remember
you
them
are
right
a
now.
little strapped for time because it's like 10
Yes.
o'clock on Sunday night. So we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care, guys.